This is All India Radio, Power of Listening. Under this series, tonight we take you on a journey to the world of yet another magnificent facet of traditional Indian knowledge systems. Annam Bahukurveet. In today's episode, we shall be focusing on the culinary traditions of ancient India. So, stay tuned to savor the flavors of our glorious culture through the ages. The most obvious is least noticed. Eyes refuse to see the closest. In history, one is prone to probe into weighty problems concerning rise and fall of empires, wars and treaties between nations. Ordinary events are taken for granted. Food is our daily need. Food is life. Annam vai pranaha, expound the Upanishads. Food not just sustains life, it nourishes human civilization and evolves into a culture. In our Indian culture, we venerate food as God. Taittiriya Upanishad, one of the oldest Upanishads, regards Anna, that is food, as Brahman, the eternal principle from which all creatures are born. Our food habits from times immemorial to the end of the 12th century of the Common Era are a major reflex of our cultural evolution. In prehistoric times, man, as a mere fruit procurer, lived on fruits, nuts, tubers, and the flesh of animals that he hunted and killed. Later, we come to a period when man produced food for himself. In the Indian subcontinent, prehistoric man was no mere barbarian. He had learned the use of betel leaves and betel nuts. He was also the first producer of rice. He used boiled rice, sour rice gruel, fried barley, and some new pulses such as marsh, urad, mudga, that is moong, and masura. We find him also frying things in oil and seasoning his meat. The palm juice industry and toddy tapping go back to that early period in our history. In the Indus Valley civilization, we come across the use of wheat, barley, and sesamum. People then domesticated buffaloes, goats, and sheep, and probably drank their milk. They used melons, dates, coconuts, and the flesh of animals, birds, and fish. Unfortunately, we do not have any kind of literature to know more about this period. Literary works are the major source to glean the food culture prevailing at the time when such texts were composed. We discussed this topic with Professor Pradeep Apte, Professor Emeritus, SP Pune University, and visiting faculty at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. He was a professor of economics at the Fergusson College, Pune. While he is an expert on subjects like international trade and agricultural economics, he is studying the history of food in India for the last several years and has delivered lectures on this topic on various platforms. He observes,
the real evidence or the real source of evidence is in fact the textual material. For example, we know that we have a very large ancient heritage which goes probably few hundred centuries back from the present era, which is usually called the Christian era, and we have the history of nearly 4,000 to 5,000 years which can be traced back in terms of the nature of ancient literature as it exists. And if we start looking at whatever kind of an ancient literature, may it be in form of Vedas, may it be in form of epics, may it be form of the later versions, for example, Smriti, Upanishad, the Puranas, each of them often have some kind of a reference to the food. And the kind of food that existed in those times is in a sense reflected and therefore congealed in form of these textual evidences. The first thing that one must appreciate in understanding the history of food is that food is, for the man, the food is primarily derived from two forms of life, which are usually called, in fact, in biological sciences, as plant kingdom and animal kingdom. And we should realize that these plant kingdoms and animal kingdoms, in fact, cover a very vast and very unimaginably large kind of a number. Very, very few, not even 1%, probably not even 0.1% of that kingdoms are actually available, accessible, and usable as food for the human beings.
Human beings had to devote a very large part of their efforts in expanding accessible and available forms of food from two categories, plant and animal. Further, man cannot use them in the raw form. It requires some processing, and that process requires some kind of technique. Particularly, the food as we understand and consume today is not all that raw. It is considerably processed. This processing requires a certain kind of technology. The two primary forms of technology are use of water, for example, washing them or boiling them, and thereby, in fact, cook them in the boiling water. Eventually, all this boiling or cooking also requires fire. So, it is the control over these two resources together with the primary sources, namely plants and animals, that condition the nature of food. The plants and animals referred to as food in old texts must have been the result of consistent previous efforts of man to make them accessible and consumable. Nature has supplied us some things ready to eat, but she also wanted man to cultivate and nurture his own food. The process of natural selection is a part of the evolution process, but here artificial selection plays a role as well. Let's listen to what Professor Apte says at this point.
We have to realize that the nature of plants as they exist have been considerably influenced by two processes which is in biological sciences called evolutionary process. One is called natural selection, other is called artificial selection. By artificial selection we mean it is the human beings which identify nature, study nature, observe it, and then modify the nature around themselves. This is something which is characteristics of human beings. And for example, there are so many kinds of grasses, and the principal grasses that we eat as food today, like for example rice or wheat or jowar or bajra, all these are grasses. Now just imagine 50,000 years back, they were like any other ordinary grasses. But now if you look at the number of plants of these particular species or these particular varieties that we look at has phenomenally increased, and the other kind of grasses which coexisted with them have phenomenally decreased. Why did this happen? Because human beings discovered them to be extremely useful, started collecting their seed and planting and replanting because they understood, they gained the knowledge of how plants grow.
Annam Bahukurvi. You should increase and amass food, says the Taittiriya Upanishad. Man has always tried to enhance availability, quality, and diversity of food, and this in turn has enhanced richness of human civilization. We find it reflected in the ancient scriptures and literature. Rigveda, the oldest extant treatise of mankind, mentions barley, milk, curds, clarified butter, mutton, and beef. It says, Saktumiva tita una punanto. Wise men speak mindfully, like the barley sifted through a sieve. There is no mention of either wheat or rice in the Rigveda. By the time of the Yajurveda, people began using wheat, rice, as well as many varieties of pulses. Since Vedic times, food is connected with rituals and festivals. Milk, curd, ghee are common oblations in the sacrificial fire during various yagyas. Even today, we find that seasonal crops and vegetables are associated with various vratas observed and festivals celebrated during those particular seasons in a year. The epics Ramayana and more so Mahabharata represent in a general way the conditions as they prevailed in the northwestern part of India. The Bhagavad Gita recognizes that the food habits vary with the temperaments of the people. Food was seen as important to a person's holiness. It was believed that a person's mind was affected by his nutrition. Along with the works composed as literary ones, medicinal treatises also give us a lot of information about the food prevalent in their times. Professor Apte states the importance of such texts when we ask his views on food as medicine.
We have another major source of understanding the food history is to read what we now call as Ayurvedic text, because from very, very ancient times, man understands the nature of nutrition that he gets or she gets. It's something which is dependent, is going to determine the healthy status of their being. Therefore, food is always considered to be the best possible medicine. And in many medical texts, therefore, you will find food and food related items are themselves considered to be the primary ingredients of treatment. Many various kinds of what we now fashionably call as pharmaceutical products are in fact isolated elements from the very same material that we have it around us, and these are in fact treated consciously as a kind of a therapy, as a kind of substances that will maintain us better, which can restore our health if it has been facing some kind of an imbalances. So food as medicine, food as nourishment, food as enjoyment, all these three elements are there which find their echoes in the ancient literature that exists.
Treating the subject scientifically, such works of Ayurveda give a list of food articles which suit people residing in different regions, as also the articles which one should consume in a particular season. The oldest known text of Ayurveda is Charaka Samhita. A systematic process of taxonomy is followed in it while dealing with various food items. Professor Apte has more to say on this.
One of the classic book that we can refer to as an Ayurvedic text, fairly ancient Ayurvedic text, and by the current standards often referred to as at least 200 years BC, but it is likely to be in fact much older than that if one considers the new kind of archaeological evidences and the climate related evidences that are forthcoming, because the nature of diversity that we find in these books being referred to as food is in fact what is called Charaka Samhita, and in Charaka Samhita there is a separate chapter which is called Annapana Vidhi, and it is here that you come across very large number of elements referred to as food. If I simply give you the list of major heads in which the nature of food that is being referred to in Charak Samhita, for example, there is something what is called Shukadhanya, that means the grains which are mostly dried grains. But among the dhanyas, there is a difference which is called a Shami Dhanya, which we often call pulses. Then there are meats, which is called Mamsa Varga. Then there is Kshira Varga, which is in fact milk and milk products. Then there is a Shaka Varga, which is in fact referring to vegetables, or the Phala Varga, which is referring to different fruits, Harita Varga, which refers to green leafy kinds of vegetables. Then Jala Varga, please remember, Jala is not only one thing, because there are different kinds of Jalas, and different kinds of Jalas have different both nourishing as well as medicinal or therapeutic properties, and the Jala could be treated in a manner such that it could be itself considered to be an important class of foods. For example, Sharbat, as we call it, is in fact primarily a Jala. There are, in fact, Jala is something which is inevitable in most part of the food. Then there is a Taila Varga. This is very important innovation, because apart from the animal fat derived either through hunting or from animal product derived, like for example, from the milk we derive the gruta, or what we call toop in many Indian languages. They were the first ingredients, and later were added another class of Taila Varga, which were in fact the kinds of oils that were extracted from various plants. For example, if you take til or taila, Taila itself is a word which actually comes from the very same sesame, that is til, and that is something which was in fact one of the dominant kind of a cooking oil which was prevalent as recently as 150 years back. It was only with the introduction of a new crop which is called groundnut, and that became popular, and that did not have a word for it, what we call a bhui moog, because there was no species of this type that was prevalent in our region, and that gradually became a lot more abundant, and therefore the taila, that is til, was replaced by what we now call as the groundnut oil. So these kind of substitutions always keep on happening. The next major class, again peculiar to India, is Ikshu Varga, something that produces sweet things, the sugar cane, that is called Ikshu Varga. And there is also Krutanna Varga, that means the food which is not naturally available as food and needs to be treated. For example, I can simply eat certain kinds of seed. I can straight away eat certain kinds of leafy vegetables. But there are certain foods which need to be cooked. And when they are cooked, that means that when they are prepared, only then they become food, and such kind of preparations are called prepared foods, and this is what is referred to in Charaka as the Krutanna Varga. Another important ingredient without which our palate does not find food very appealing, and that is something which is called salts of different types. Remember, there are so many oceans around the world which are predominantly salty, but you don't get salt so easily. You are required to in fact treat the so-called salty water of seas and extract salt out of it. And interestingly enough, this is the one of the primary ingredient of our food system, which also has great medicinal and therapeutic properties and characteristic, and that is the element which is in fact inorganic in nature. All rest of the food is primarily organic, maybe from plant or made from animal kingdom, but salt belongs to a class which is not really organic. So without this inorganic presence, we don't in fact find our food to be palatable enough. Charak refers to not only salt as a one class, but in fact he talks about various kinds of salts. In fact, there are various kinds of salts which were available in India. Many a times they were identified by the region in which they were found. There are two kinds of salts which we even today ordinarily refer to, something which has been produced from the seawater, or something which is in fact like a mining material. We mine salt because they are in fact the remnants of the erstwhile seawater, which due to tectonic shifts got in fact buried into the first or second layer of the earth, and the saltiness of that is conserved, but more in the nature of as if it was a kind of a soil, and that is something which we even eat today, and we still call it to be Saindava. In fact, this is one kind of a class of salt which is being referred to in Charaka. There are also different kinds of what I have referred to as a Ikshu Varga. It is not always confined to Ikshu, that is the sugarcane alone, but there are also other kinds of sources which we find in ancient literature, which are in fact primarily responsible for the nature of sweet taste that we get. For example, what we call palms, the tad or the mad, whose juice can be used for extraction of something which is akin to sugar. So in fact, we do have even today in parts of India primarily consume sugar-like substance, but not necessarily derived from sugarcane, and this was also a very widely practiced kind of a food, in particularly in certain regions where the palm kinds of trees were more easily and abundantly available.
From ancient medicinal works, we learn that Indians used more than 40 varieties of rice, 60 varieties of fruits, including some dry fruits such as almonds, and more than 120 vegetables. Meat soup is regarded as the most nourishing food, and wines taken in moderation are considered as wholesome as nectar itself. This richness of food may have been a result of the wealth which was pouring into India from Western countries as a result of the foreign trade during the Kushana period. People were vegetarians as well as non-vegetarians. Both Buddha and Mahavir were major proponents of non-violence. Jains did not take even those fruits or vegetables in which there was probability of the existence of any living organism. Even water was to be strained before being used for drinking purposes. On the other hand, people residing in the hills were generally non-vegetarians. According to Megasthenes, Brahmins generally avoided meat. Onions were generally used by non-vegetarians. Influence of Shraman tradition, particularly Buddhism, became deeper in the reign of King Ashok, which is a landmark in the development of the idea of vegetarianism. Manasollas, a 12th century encyclopedic Sanskrit treatise by King Someshwara, in its Annabhoga section, deals mainly with meat preparations and describes the various delicacies in detail. Professor Apte remarks more on meat eating in ancient India.
Did our ancestors eat meat? Because we happen to be a country where a very large section of population is not eating meat. They are considered to be what is often called as Shakahari. In fact, they are the people who don't consume meat. It is not the case that they don't consume any animal derived product, obviously, because for example, milk also is an animal derived product, but they don't eat meat. So there are people who eat meat of the some elements of animal kingdom. Again, if you refer to Charaka Samhita, you will find a very shocking kind of a list, because there probably every kind of an animal is being referred to as a potential source of meat. And please understand that when Charaka refers to them as a source of meat, it may not be the meat in the ordinary sense of food alone. Some of these meats are considered to have a superior and different kind of a medicinal and therapeutic value. Don't be shocked if you come across in Charaka. For example, in Charaka there are many animals which we will otherwise consider to be wild animals. And in fact, in the later texts, you will find that the meat of these animals is in fact forbidden. For example, if you look at the list of meats which are considered as forbidden kinds of meats in Manusmriti, you will find they being referred to as a source of meat in Charak. When Charak is speaking about Annapana Vidhi, he is talking about the food as well as one particular aspect of food which, for as a great medicinal sage, were of importance to him, namely therapeutic value of food. So many kinds of milks. For example, we will not ordinarily consider the milk of, for example, a tigress, or milk of a mare, that is the horse, female horse, or the female donkey. But all of these are being referred to as a source of milk. Not necessarily because they were consumed in large quantities or in the ordinary course of food preparation, but primarily because even though they are rare, they happen to have certain kind of a medicinal cum therapeutic property.
Rice is one of the chief grains of India. It has the largest area under rice cultivation, as it is one of the principal food crops. Rice is also grown through irrigation in those areas that receive comparatively less rainfall. Rice is the staple food of eastern and southern parts of India. Perennial wild rice still grows in Assam and Nepal. It seems to have appeared around 1400 before Common Era in southern India after its domestication in the northern plains. Let's learn more about rice from Professor Apte.
Which was probably the widest and most extensively cultivated and most extensively consumed kind of a food grain in those time? The answer, at least for the period of Charak as well as later Sushrut, happens to be rice. And even today, the largest food grain which is consumed in India continues to be rice. And there are two varieties of rice which are primarily distinguished in terms of the so-called Rutu, or the season in which the rice is planted and grown. The one which is planted in monsoon times and also by and large harvested at the end of the monsoon times is called Shali. And those which are in fact planted usually at the end or the tail end of the monsoon season, but harvested on the basis of whatever that is water is available, that is enough to grow the remaining part of the life of that the plant, namely the rice plant. But it is distinguished. It is distinguished not only in its taste, not only in its so-called cooking time, but also in terms of its medical and therapeutic value. And therefore, there are two classes of rice which are always emphatically distinguished, which is called Shali as against Vrihi. Most of the rice, if to give you a flavor of what kinds of things we are referring to when you are talking of Vrihi, that Vrihi is something what we can ordinarily now call Delhi rice, the long grain rice which is typically used for certain kinds of preparation, and that Vrihi is in fact a root word which also gets its reflective kind of an equivalent word in Persian, and that Persian word in fact gave rise to the word which is called birinj, and therefore birinjani, that is biryani. And this birinj is in fact also distinguished even in the Persian region. There are two kinds of names. One is called chelo, other is called polo. Polo is a word from which the term pulao comes. So these are one of the most important distinguished classes of rice, very broad classes of rice, and within them there are many varieties of them. For example, take shali, you will find a very long list of shalis. There is a shali which is distinguished as Shashti Shali. Shashti Shali means that particular variety of rice which becomes mature for harvesting only in 60 days. So it is the most short maturity kind of a crop which still survives in India. Similarly, there are also many other varieties which are distinguished by their colors. For example, there is a Krishna Shali, there is a Rakta Shali. We have the Marathi equivalent or Hindi equivalent which is often called Tamshal or Tamsal or Kalisal. These are in fact nothing but the Krishna Shali or the Rakta Shali which is being referred to in Charak. If you look at that list, one should in fact ponder over this fact that when there are so many varieties, how many varieties exist today? They are also distinguished by the kind of fragrance that the rice one gets in cooking, which is popularly known. For example, there is certain kind of a jasmine variety because they have a jasmine-like fragrance. There is a variety which is popular in parts of Maharashtra, which is called Ambe Mohor, because when you cook it, the kind of fragrance that the so-called flowering of the mangoes release is the same kind of a fragrance that you get when you cook that rice. So these are distinguished by a variety of things, like for example duration for their maturity. It could be the color, it could be the nature of fragrance, it could also be the nature of cooking qualities. For example, particularly in the class of Rui, it takes more time. It takes therefore more water to boil. Only when they are boiled with sufficient time and sufficient quantity of water, then it becomes really more tasty, easily consumable, or having even certain medicinal properties. In fact, in Charak, you also get how many kinds of preparations of shali or vrihi you can get by simply varying the quantity of water that you are using to cook it, and also the amount of water that you would retain, that means not allow it to evaporate, and that causes variety of dishes prepared out of it.
Do you know that in the north, they tended to eat food that was more bland with a lot of dairy products and lentils? In the south, the food was spicier and was served with rice and maybe coconut. Those who lived near the oceans, rivers or lakes had fish and seafood in their menu. Rice and fish were and still are the main items of food in the eastern part of the country. Professor Apte on the diversity of food in India.
If we are to look at the nature of diversity of food that must have existed in India, it's really very amazingly large, partly because we are a continental country. Number two, we are not only continental country, but we also happen to be a country which has got different vegetations in different regions. In fact, Charak himself distinguishes three kinds of regions. They are by and large based on the relative abundance of water, or for that matter, relative scarcity of matter. For example, there is something which is referred to as Anupa region, where the water is abundant. There is something which is called a Sadharana region, and there is something which is called as a Jangal region. Jangal means something what we use as a jungle, and contrary to the popular notion, it is not a very dense forest, but in fact it is a very sparse and bushy kind of a forest. And why is that forest bushy? Because the rainfall in that region happens to be relatively deficient. So these are the three types of soils, three types of regions distinguished by the nature of relative abundance or relative scarcity of water, and that is something which governs the viability of the plant life, therefore the viability and availability of the food which is derivable in those regions.
If you look at the availability of what we called Kukkutavarga, for example chicken, has become abundant only in recent times. Hardly 60 years ago, chicken was considered a relative rarity and therefore an article for food only on special kinds of occasions. That means, for a feast, chicken was prepared while other meats were for ordinary daily consumption. India is a land of diversity and more so with regards to our cuisine. But the unity in diversity is reflected in the use of spices. Spices and oils were used for seasoning the various food articles. Ancient Indians knew how to dry and pickle food to preserve it. They cooked using clay ovens, cauldrons and open fires. Distilled beverages are also found mentioned in ancient literature. In South India, rich liquors imported from the West were used by members of royal families, and country wine was drunk by the poor because toddy tapping had been in existence there from times immemorial. Sura or Madhya are the words for liquor in Sanskrit language. However, the Vedic juice called Soma was not an intoxicant but just an energy drink like tea. Professor Apte explains in detail.
So the question often asked is, did our ancestors drink any spirituous kind of drinks which are often called liquors? The answer for that is unambiguously yes. In fact, there is a long list of different kinds of liquors that are referred to in Charak from different sources, though principally in India the primary source of production of liquors happens to be of three types, and that is something probably most aptly summarized in Manusmriti, which says Gaudi Paishti cha Madhvi cha Vidneyam Trivida Sura. Sura is not same thing as Som. One of the popular misconception is that the Vedic Som is same thing as Sura. That's not the case. Som is a different kind of a plant, and Sura is a preparation made from either Paishti, that means from the flour, or from Madhvi, that means from honey, or Gaudi, that means from different kinds of sugars. Most predominantly, in fact, tar or the palm class of sugars were often used. In fact, the seepage of the palm or palm kind of trees is something which happens to be the most popular kind of a drink from which the spirituous liquors were made. And Charak refers to both desirable as well as undesirable effects of the spirituous liquor and its consumption, and also the upashama for this, something which is often called a hangover, and how to treat the hangover is also happens to be a part of description in both Sushrut as well as in Charak.
In modern India, scholars like Professor P.K. Gode, Dr. Om Prakash have tried to trace the antiquity of food articles in India. Gode, first curator of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, has written a number of articles on the antiquity of food items like rice, jawar, maize, fig, almond, mustard, tea, fenugreek, horse gram, gram or chana, jalebi, betel nuts, tobacco, etc. With globalization, Indian pungent and spicy food is cherished in Western countries, and in India, we enjoy the so-called Chinese cuisine with a strong Indian blend. Does man make food, or food make man the way he is? Food habits culminate into a culture, and the culture nourishes food the way it is. Food is a vrata, that is, a vow or a resolve. Food is prana, that is, life energy. Annam vai pranaha. In the words of Taittiriya Upanishad, Annam na nindyat tadavratam. One should not blame food, because that is the resolve of vow. Annam bahu kurveet. One should increase and amass food. That is the pious observance. Annam Bahu Kurveet. You just heard the 13th episode of our all-new series on traditional Indian knowledge systems, Power of Listening. We hope you enjoyed it. The program was scripted by Dr. Amruta Natu. Special thanks to AIR Pune, Amol, Parth and Randheer Thakur for their contributions. This series has been conceptualized by Shashi Shekhar Vempati, CEO Prasar Bharati, and produced by Vinod Kumar and Neelima Patwardhan. This episode is also available on our official YouTube channel, Akashvani AIR. We'll be back on the 31st of December, same time, same frequencies, with another episode. This is Manoj Mainkar signing off. Bye for now.